Welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. My name is Joe Lopez with the Richard Nixon Foundation, an alum of Cal State Fullerton and former student body president, so I am extremely thrilled to have you here today in our East Room. This is the type of program that President Nixon would have loved to see happen at his presidential library. And though the Berlin Wall fell 15 years after he left office, there's no doubt he felt a sense of victory on that day. Nixon was the first president to visit Moscow, first U.S. president, and his work with the leaders of the Soviet Union helped ease the tensions of the Cold War. In his 1990 book, In the Arena, the year after the Berlin Wall fell, he wrote these words about that event. He wrote, "Virtually all objective observers agree that in 1989, the world experienced a watershed year. The great battle has been won, but the war is not over. For the West, the great challenge in Eastern Europe, more difficult than tearing down the Berlin Wall, is to help build new systems that will not dash the euphoric expectations of those who risk so much in supporting the revolution." So with that, once again, I'd like to welcome you, and I look forward to today's discussion on that great challenge. I'd like to invite our four panelists up to the stage, and Dr. Steve Stambaugh will introduce them.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome everyone. When we started to brainstorm about an idea to provide an educational experience to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, we thought we really should do something a little bit bigger than have a standard talk on campus. So we started to brainstorm, and it started to work a little bit with our Office of Government and Community Relations, with Owen Holmes' office, with my colleague down at the end of the table, Professor Corriganata from European Studies, and myself over in the Division of Politics, Administration, and Justice. And we realized that we could do this a little bit bigger and a little bit better. So we wanted to involve the community, we wanted to involve the students, we wanted to involve the university. So we worked with our college. We have our Associate Dean, Lynn Sargent, in the back, and with Joe over with the Nixon Foundation. And we realized that this is probably, I can tell you that this room is a much better visual and a much better experience of what we have on campus. This is a great experience over here. When we conceived the event, what we were hoping for was to take a look at the 25th anniversary from a couple of different perspectives and hopefully try to marriage the two and try to bring the two together a little bit. And those two perspectives are the applied world of politics and the academic study of world events. And we realized that the two really can inform each other, the two can build upon each other, and the two have a lot in common. So with that in mind, what we wanted to do was to bring in our two main guest speakers, who I will introduce, and then I'll introduce everybody here to begin with, and then we will start with our first one, who is Congressman Ed Royce. Congressman Royce is serving his 11th term in Congress, representing California's 39th district, based right here in this area, Orange, Los Angeles, San Bernardino counties. Congressman Royce has played a significant role in a broad range of policy areas, including crime, supporting victims of crime, international and domestic finance, and his work is leading the House, former work is leading the House Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade, just to name a few of those. More directly for today's program, we welcome Congressman Royce as chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman Royce has served on the committee since entering in 1993, and immediately becoming chairman of this committee, he served as chairman of the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade, and is a member of the Subcommittee in Asian and Pacific. Congressman Royce is no stranger to the community and most definitely not a stranger to Cal State Fullerton. We're proud to refer to him as one of our graduates, and we're just as proud with his continued relationship with our university, such as when he recently held a field hearing committee on our campus dealing with issues of international human trafficking. On a personal note, I've been very happy to work with the congressman and the congressman's office in their role as internship mentors. We've sent a large number of students out to his office here locally and in Washington, D.C., and they've had an incredible experience working with the congressman and working for the congressman's office, and many of them ended up turning this into the beginning stages of a career. So with that, we most definitely welcome Congressman Royce and look forward to his comments. I'm going to introduce Professor Dalton, just give you the bio on that, and then I will turn the program over to these two. Professor Russ Dalton is a professor of political science at the University of California, Irvine, where he was founding director of the Center for the Study of Democracy. His research and teaching interests focus on the role of citizens in the political process and how democracies can better address public preferences in the democratic ideal. His early work examined the German transition to democracy following the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany. His book, Germany Transformed, documented the transformation of the post-war political culture. He also authored Politics in Germany and a series of books and journal issues and journal articles on German elections. He has continued to study the evolution of public opinion in contemporary Germany and is one of America's leading scholars on German public opinion and elections. Later work included studies about the process of value change in industrial societies, such as the emergence of green political movements, feminist groups, and other social movements that began to transform the politics of Western democracies. When the third wave of democratization began in the 1990s, his research turned to the role of citizens in the democracy process, including an examination of the East German transition to democracy following the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Professor Dalton received his PhD from the University of Michigan, was an undergraduate relatively locally here at UCLA, and he's appeared in 8 Hollywood feature films, which I'm sure we'll hear more about in the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to begin with comments by Congressman Royce, followed by comments by Professor Dalton. Professor Granata and I will lead a few questions, but then we'd like to turn it over to a Q&A session and hear what you have to say and hear what you're interested in. So with that, I'd like to welcome Congressman Royce, and thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much, Stephen. I think the most interesting part of this will probably be the Q&A afterwards, so we're looking forward to engaging the audience here. I wanted to just thank Cal State Fullerton as well for the understanding that as we look at current affairs, as we look at some of the challenges in politics, it is Cal State Fullerton and the political science department there that understands that it's the long shadow of history and the long, deep impact of culture that plays such a role in these challenges. And on that issue, I would just like to thank Professor Granata for her being with us, for Cora being with us today, because she's done a lot of very interesting work on German nationalism and what that meant, the impact that had on Slavic minorities and Jewish minorities, other minorities in Germany, and certainly the rather renowned Professor Dalton as well, who's with us for his work on the German transition to democracy. I would just start by making the observation that what we are talking about, the fall of the Berlin Wall here, and it doesn't seem that long ago to many of us here in the audience, but for the students, it's history. It happened before they were born. It's ancient history for most of the students that go to Cal State Fullerton. But for us, it was a time of great drama. And I think it's most unfortunate that Germany itself has tried to erase this from its history. If you go to Germany, I mean, the wall, I think it was a bit of an embarrassment for the Germans. It divided Germany. They wanted the traces of the wall removed. And I think they saw it as sort of another example of a shameful past. I remember trying to go to Dachau. My father had taken photographs there when Dachau was liberated. And at that point in time, Germany had tried to disguise that. Today, it's a different attitude. Today, Germany, has the signage up, and you can go and you can visit the camp. I hope the day will come when Germany focuses more on that wall, because I think that, in fact, the breach in that wall represented a historic event of great magnitude in terms of the annals of human freedom. And I think that it's right that the Nixon Library here has prominently displayed an example, a section of the wall, to inspire all, who will come to this site. I think as we reflect on it, it was the people of Berlin, West and East, who felt the tragedy of that wall most directly. But its importance was not confined to Germany, to one city, to one country. It was, and I think will always remain, a symbol of a rather titanic struggle, yes, between the West and the Soviet Union, but more than that, a struggle between a totalitarian system and what we define here as freedom. And I think that is what it will be remembered for. And that struggle against the Soviet system is celebrated today, and I think rightfully so. But another aspect of the wall is it reminds us that totalitarianism certainly is not over. There are challenges that free people, that humanity have faced over the years, but today a prominent one is probably ISIL, as we reflect on the barbarism posed by that particular system. So there's new walls being erected, even as we speak, because walls are necessary to subjugate people to totalitarian systems. North Korea is a fortress built to confine its greatest enemy, and that's its own people. And I've been in North Korea, had a chance to see what that system is like. ISIL is constructing walls of fear and brutality and murder. Iran tries to seal off its population from outside influences that would challenge the regime's hold on power. And so these are among some of the prominent challenges that I think humanity faces, but there are many others. So the wall offers many lessons, and I think we need to be wise enough to heed some of those lessons. Some people portray our victory there as being foreordained, that the superiority of our system was so compelling that the dictatorships were destined to crumble. I wish it was that easy. The effort to take down that wall took decades, and it was marked by many setbacks, and it was marked often by increased repression, and there was no straight line forward in terms of the march of freedom with respect to that wall. It required a commitment to the long term, and not the expectation that freedom would come in a single easy act. The wall fell, but only years after the constant undermining and battering from within and without. And a second lesson demonstrated by the fall of the wall is that freedom is rarely in our power to grant. It cannot be bestowed by one people on another, regardless of how good the intentions might be. It must be earned by those who desire it for themselves and for their country. And the truth is that the people of Central and Eastern Europe who were trapped in the Soviet Empire freed themselves. The U.S. and our allies in Europe were vital to that effort over the long, dark years, especially by ensuring that truth penetrated the propaganda. But in the end, the only route to freedom is to earn it, and only then can it be truly valued and understood and defended. I wanted to talk to you about the importance of information, which I think was critical with respect to that wall coming down, at least from what I've heard from Václav Havel and Lech Walesa. And in 1984, I visited East Germany on the American Council of Young Political Leaders program. And I spoke with Germans, young and old, who told me that they eagerly sought news, more information from the West, which they valued as uncensored, accurate, and credible. And for decades, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Voice of America played an essential role in combating Soviet propaganda, but it was not until we actually got young East Germans and Czechs and Russians and Poles up on the line, up on the phones and radios, up on the networks, who knew the Poles who had recently immigrated from those countries. It was not until actually the Reagan administration that we changed the course of the programming. I can tell you, I saw the impact of bombastic West German propaganda. It did not move the needle. But the information that did was the information coming from recent Eastern Europeans who transmitted information. And so when given a choice, the population put their faith in the information provided by the radio services instead of the crude distortions of the regime's official news services, and especially those broadcasts that dealt with the concepts of political pluralism, of tolerance, of the idea of freedom of speech. Now, today, Mr. Putin understands the power of ideas, of bad ideas. And today we see that our allies in Central and Eastern Europe, especially in the Baltic states, are once again targeted with propaganda from Moscow. But unlike during the Cold War, this propaganda is far, far more sophisticated, employing cutting-edge technology, attractive graphics, subtle messages, and most importantly, state-run Russian media is on 24 hours a day across all platforms, including radio, television, internet, and social media. A key goal is to stoke sectarian fears and incite violence in targeted countries. In Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has used this sophisticated media machine to divide the Ukrainian population, to construct an environment where it was difficult to distinguish fact from fiction and create a pretext for invasion. What we are witnessing, what I heard when I was in Ukraine recently, is the weaponization of information. And I actually heard this in the East. We were in the West and the East, but in the Russian-speaking region, the weaponization of information is a concern, because Russia is using this strategy not just in their broadcasts in the Russian-speaking regions, but increasingly across Central Europe. And it's already signaled its intent, the regime, to expand its reach further west. And it speaks with one voice. The editor of the last independent paper in Moscow has lost his last 6 reporters to assassination, and all 6 had been critical. And in the meantime, the electronic media is very, very much under the control of the Russian government. So RT, formerly known as Russia Today, will launch a German language news channel within months. A second Russian state media outlet, RIA Novista, is opening a bureau to run German language websites and social media accounts and a 24-hour radio station in Germany. Russian efforts to infiltrate the German market and influence public opinion is quite troubling. Unfortunately, there is a very receptive audience. A recent poll of Germans found that 42% thought the German media's reporting on Russia to be exaggerated and distorted. And this is the opening that Russian state media wants to exploit. Just last week, it was reported that Russian state media plans to open media centers in 29 cities across Europe, including the Balkans and Hungary. And again, this is not a media based or a system based on Jefferson's absolutism about the right to free speech. Under the Russian media today, there is but one viewpoint. Thus far, the West's response to Russia's weaponization of information has been haphazard. The tools at the disposal to the United States, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Voice of America, have been too slow to adapt to the transformation of the media since the end of the Cold War, and frankly are practically defunct. They are hindered by their own bureaucracy, by a reluctance to adapt to the new and competitive media market, where the battle of ideas is being waged. In July, the House unanimously passed my committee's legislation to reform the Broadcasting Board of Governors, the BBG, the organization that oversees Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and that oversees the VOA. This legislation is now in the Senate, and it should be passed immediately upon our return so that our broadcasters can effectively and efficiently respond to the challenges we face today. We cannot allow the U.S. to continue to be on the defensive, responding to events as they unfold. We need to adapt. Vladimir Putin, the head of state for Russia, poses a growing challenge, I think, to countries in Europe, and his goal is focused not on the future, but on the past, namely to resurrect the Russian Empire through which Moscow ruled over not only the vast territory inhabited by ethnic Russians, but by many people beyond. And he has been pursuing this goal since he came to power. But his actions were largely unnoticed by the world until his outright aggression in the Ukraine made them undeniable. He's employing all the tools at his disposal, from economic coercion to ethnic division to military invasion and outright annexation. He's threatened NATO countries, particularly the Baltic states. The ambassadors have been in to see me from Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania. He repeatedly used Europe's dependence on energy to exert pressure on individual countries and on the continent in Europe. And although our eyes in the West are focused on Eastern Europe, Putin's reach has extended into Central Asia, where he has forced countries such as Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan to comply with his goal of expanding Russia's sphere of influence. I recently returned from Armenia and from Azerbaijan, and similarly, Armenia was forced to reverse its efforts to increase its ties with Europe as a result of pressure. And so its economic future and prosperity are ever more closely dependent now on Russia. The same pressure is being applied to Azerbaijan. I talked to their consul general here last night. And again, the problem is the same. The Russian-speaking news services broadcast into all of those countries in Central Asia and East Asia, and their intelligence services exert tremendous influence from the Baltic states, and to the east. The principal obstacle, of course, to Putin's ambitions is the U.S. and its allies in NATO. NATO is the most successful alliance in recent human history. In the 65 years since its founding, Europe's been transformed from a warring continent to one of peace in which democracy and freedom have expanded country by country. It has brought a peace and security to Europe that was unknown in the preceding 1,500 years since the collapse of the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, the end of the Soviet military threat 2 decades ago has led many to assume that peace is the normal state for Europe, requiring no effort to maintain. And as a result, many countries in Europe have irresponsibly cut their defense spending to levels that have undermined the continent's defenses. The U.S. can't care more about Europe's defenses than the Europeans do themselves. Now, I thought I'd just make a few in closing comments about President Nixon, since we're at this site today. And I think he had a grasp of history and knowledge of the dangers of the world. And he would have been the first to state that what I've explained is a highly dangerous illusion that must eventually result in insecurity, because weakness is always dangerous. He's among our foreign policy leaders because he had no illusions about the world and none regarding the enemies we faced. But he was neither a cynic nor a believer in America's inevitable decline, which frankly was very fashionable at that time in the 70s, and it is now. He knew what was at stake, namely the security and freedom of our country and the preservation of the values it represented for the world with respect to foreign policy, and the responsibility we carry for others. not because we were meddling in the affairs of others, but because we had an interest in stability and freedom. When he visited Berlin in 1969, he went to the wall and stood on a raised platform to look directly into East Germany. And he understood that the wall was much more than simply a symbol of a divided city. It was part of a much larger wall, the deadly boundary of a gigantic prison behind which hundreds of millions of people were trapped, where hope was a very precious and a very fragile thing. He demonstrated that understanding in his speech in Berlin when he spoke directly to the audience and said, "Sometimes you must feel very much alone, but always remember, we are with you, and people who are free and want to be free are with you." As I noted previously, that is why I'm pleased that this library has displayed a large section of the barrier, and because it is a reminder not only of the wall coming down, but a turning point in history, a reminder also of President Nixon's commitment not only to our country, but to those in other countries, free and unfree alike. And frankly, a commitment which was later followed up on by the leadership of President Reagan, who did help deliver, especially when he articulated those words. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. But perhaps more importantly, when he changed the course of our broadcasting into Eastern Europe, into a system which was far more relevant to the truth about what was going on in those countries and information about what was going on across the world, and managed to reach a generation of Eastern Europeans and Russians and give them a vision of a society based upon a more democratic system, political pluralism, tolerance, freedom of speech. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here, Steve, and the faculty, students from Cal State Fullerton. Both my sons graduated from Cal State, so even though they wanted to be a little bit further away from Irvine and chose Pomona and other campuses, there's a special tie to the CSU system. I also want to thank Congressman Royce. He was a visitor at Irvine several years ago, but since then, the role he's played in the House, and it's kind of quite unusual if you're a normal academic to take the podium with someone whose campaign ads are there on the way in on Yorba Linda Boulevard, and to take time out from the last day of the campaign to come here is a special kind of sign of his commitment to you.
Russ, I'm glad I got him up before you got here.
No, I thought of getting one and getting it signed, but then Irvine is out of your district, so it wouldn't go so well on eBay.
You never know with reapportionment, Russ, you never know.
And last two observations to start with. When Steve asked me to do it, I said I was glad to, because there's a certain commitment to people who do European studies to pay attention to the Berlin Wall coming down, because it played a special part in German history. But then I had this pause because I thought, well, it must be at least 15 or 20 years. And then when I figured it had been so long, I then thought, could I convince them I was only 20 at the time? My wife said, no, 25, no. And when it got to that, it's hard to believe, because for those of us who remember seeing the Berlin Wall and going through the no man's land and seeing the wall itself, but also the buffer zone and the machine guns, I mean, it left an experience that you'd never forget. And when we watched the wall come down, and then I realized all of you students are born, or almost all of you, unless you're returning students, were born after the Berlin Wall. So it's become a part of history. But for us, it's very real, and I think for you it should also be very real, because the impact of history that Congressman Royce described, on the one hand, it really transformed the lives of 16 million East Germans, but it also transformed the lives of tens of millions of Europeans. And so his points about the impact of that historical event was important. The other part is the lessons that it has, as he illustrated with contemporary politics. You know, there's a line common to historians about that if you forget history, you're bound to repeat it, especially in the case of German politics, because there's another line in comparative politics that the history of happy countries is boring to read. And if anything, German history isn't boring. Its high points and low points make it a kind of exceptional case of European politics, but also politics in general. My own research has been about the public opinion in Germany, beginning with the post-war World War II era up to the present. So with the congressman focusing on the policy, I want to give you the perspective from the average citizen who lived through that experience. But before doing that, wanted to play a kind of academic game of Mythbusters for the students who are probably more familiar with this. At the time of German unification, it was a surprise and amazing event to most adults who were living at the time, because we had a set of myths about East Germany that colored the way that we viewed the events. The first was that the East Germans were the powerhouse, the economic powerhouse of the communist world. The statistics at the time were interpreted to say that East Germans lived at 80% the living standard of Westerners. Secondly, that this is where, if anywhere, communism worked. They were the leader. If you were to buy a communist computer, it was made in East Germany. If you were going to buy communist scientific equipment, it was built in East Germany. We found out after the wall that this was all a myth, that it was a shell game, kind of like in Hollywood, with the front of the buildings looking really nice, but you go inside and there was very little. I remember talking to a number of German businessmen who went over after unification to help with economic development in the East, and they said it's like walking into a museum. They hadn't seen such old-fashioned equipment since they were in their own youth. The second myth was that the political system was well-functioning, that if the Russians could depend on anyone to back them up, the East Germans were the ones who were the most loyal of the Warsaw Bloc nations, that they were committed to the political system that they had. And I'll talk about in a minute or two how that myth was wrong. And we found out only after the wall came down. The third myth was that somehow German unification would be bad for Europe, or at least specific countries in Europe. It's hard to believe Margaret Thatcher was vocally and informally off the record quite skeptical about German unification, in part for British national interest, but in part worried about what it would mean for Germany and Europe in a negative sense because of these first 2 points I mentioned of the image that people had of East Germany. There was an old quote from French politics that started circulating around France at the time. And the quote was back from when there was original idea of German rearmament, et cetera, and a French parliamentarian saying, "I love Germany so much, I'm glad there's two of them." Because he didn't want to see two Germanys united to rival French power. Several cycles ago, I had the fortune to be at the Bush Library, Bush 41, for a similar event. And it's clear that without George Bush Sr.'s role in pushing through German unification, it would have been a much more difficult path, in part because our allies were ambivalent about it. Now that's a myth, because one sees the role that Germany has played and what has happened since unification. But I think the first specific lesson that comes out of it is that we had overestimated our opponents. We had presumed positive things about the viability and the success of the GDR regime that weren't true. And in part, we presumed that because we had very little information and access and misinterpreted data. It was really a regime that was struggling to survive. If they had persisted, they might have lasted another decade or another 2 decades, but it was a regime that was clearly on the decline, and only a small portion of the international community realized how extensive that weakness was. So let me shift to the focus of what I wanted to share, the research I've done on public opinion. I began as a graduate student at the University of Michigan doing public opinion work on post-World War II Germans, and was just about to give up German studies because it was starting to get happy and boring when the wall came down. And for the next decade, it was kind of like Lewis and Clark. We were going to unexplored territory where we had heard stories of what it was like, but we had never been able to, as scientists, study what was going on in the East. One of the myths of the time was that the East Germans, kind of like these first myths I told you, were supportive of the regime, that they were socialized and raised under a system that inculcated the values of a socialist personality. One of the commentators from West Germany at the time, a prominent political analyst, was talking about unification as a mistake because the East is occupied by 16 million crazies, and they're going to disrupt our well-functioning country here in the West if we let them in. Almost as soon as the wall came down, survey researchers, my colleagues in Germany that I've worked with, went east to start doing public opinion work. And what we found was dramatically different from what we found in post-World War II Germany. The West Germans had shown for several decades the development of a democratic culture by repeatedly asking a set of questions in public opinion surveys that measured political tolerance, respect for free speech, acceptance of opposition, the citizens' right to protest is important. When that survey was first replicated in 1991, East Germans scored higher than West Germans on their democratic values. There's a standard question that says, democracy may have its faults, but it's better than other forms of government. The kind of Churchillian takeoff. Democracy's better than all the alternatives. East and West Germans in 1990, in the midst of unification, shared the same positive opinion, about 90% saying democracy may have its faults, but it's the best form of government. So there was an underestimation of the appeal of democracy, and I think the values that East Germans had at the time, we had underestimated because we had only looked at that Hollywood facade, what the regime looked at from the outside. So we began this transition to democracy with a very different situation than 1945, where East Germans wanted to have democracy. And one might say that, why would we take this as serious opinions And my answer has always been, they were the people who really knew what the alternative was, because they had lived under the alternative and they had struggled under the alternative. So when comparing democracy to an ideal, for us it's an academic enterprise. For them it was a reality. A second characteristic of the transition, and this is probably difficult for students and adults to understand, is the tremendous social dislocation that resulted from German unification. This wasn't an easy task, because what we found out was the economies weren't equal. It was an old Rust Belt economy in the East using outmoded technology, horrible environmental conditions, versus, it was like comparing their little two-cylinder Trabant car to a BMW. It isn't a fair race. So there was a real economic struggle. Most East Germans lost their jobs or had to change jobs as a result of unification. As good or bad as your job might be, if most people in the country changed jobs within a 5-year period, that's a pretty substantial dislocation. For many, it was unemployment. Unemployment in the East rose to higher levels than during the Great Depression. Fortunately, with the benefits of the West German social welfare system, so the strain was less than it was in the Great Depression. You had to get a new bank. So if you moved, you know what a hassle it is to move. But it was like everybody in the country moved, but they stood still. The world changed out from underneath their feet. The stores changed, the banks changed. You had to get a new driver's license, a new identity card. You had to learn a new social system, new post office. Even the street might change. If you lived on Karl Marx Strasse, it probably changed, right? It probably became Konrad Adenauer Strasse. In fact, I remember a West German professor who got a job in Potsdam at the new university, which ironically had been a training institute for Stasi agents. The West took it over and turned it into a university for students. He was driving me through Potsdam and he said, "Did you see that?" I said, "That's the only thing we have left from before the wall came down." So I looked around for a statue of Karl Marx, or I looked for an old Communist Party headquarters, and all I saw were Kentucky Fried Chicken, Western stores, nothing that looked unusual. And finally I came in and said, "Well, what's the one thing left?" And he said, "They got rid of all of our laws. The only thing they kept is you can turn right on a red light. Everything else has changed." So this was a difficult time. Yes. This was really a difficult time for East Germans. They won freedom. They didn't want to go back, but it was a time of tremendous social disruption. Many had to move, but even if you didn't move, everything you carry in your pocket changed, right? All of your identities changed. The way you did business changed. And so it was a really substantial disruption. And psychologically, there was one other change of a sense of accomplishment, but also a sense of frustration. Certainly none of the politicians we know who are in this room apply, but politicians in Germany promised a lot and didn't deliver. They promised taxes wouldn't go up. They went up within 3 months after the election. They promised blooming landscapes in the East. The East didn't bloom quite so fast or quite so much. They were promised a lot, and the West Germans said, well, of course, that's what politicians do. They tell you one thing and no offense, they say one thing and they do another. The Westerners were cynical. The Easterners were idealistic. and were somewhat frustrated that democracy didn't live up to the ideal that they had, that what you see is open, honest discourse, and the economy didn't bloom, the society didn't change as rapidly as they had been promised. It didn't shake their basic values, but it created a sense of frustration. Also in a sense of second-class citizenship. So a new term sprung up, OCs and Wessies. If you ever have a chance, two good movies to see if you're a student. If you're in a class, talk to get extra credit for doing a movie review of Goodbye Lenin, the kind of struggle of some East Germans to see it go and the happiness of others to see it go, and Into the Arms, no, not Into the Arms District, Lives of Others, what life was really like. So one shows how life is improved, the other shows the life they left behind. So it was a combination of those two sentiments that guided the next 20 years of German unification. The East Germans trying to catch up from a start that wasn't as good as what they thought, with a system that was helping but not as much, and a West feeling like they were helping more than they should have. Right? But if we fast forward to today, so if I look at political scientists or academics in general, we tend to be very critical. We tell you what's wrong with things. I had a period of reflection when Steve asked me to think, well, what's really changed since German unification? Not what are all the problems, but what would an East German feel? And then go to the polls to look for it. And part of this comes from teaching German politics. I used to give an assignment where I asked students to pick a social group in the East, like you could write about farmers, and you could write about soldiers, and you could write about women in the East, and then tell me, what do they feel happened to them after unification? About 2/3 of those answers were worse off. If you asked farmers and women and blue-collar workers, 2/3, 3/4 of them say we're better off. And the record over that 20 years was mixed, imperfect, but most East Germans today have a higher standard of living, have an access to alternatives that they didn't used to have, are able to travel and control their lives with freedoms that they didn't have. A series of surveys that we've done over 20 years about quality of life. How satisfied are you with your housing? How satisfied are you with your income? How satisfied are you with your X, Y, and Z? Had originally a big gap. Now it's become very small, almost insignificant in 20 years. It'll take another, the big advances come early, and it's kind of, you catch up, and then as you get closer, it takes a little bit longer to get that last 10 or 20%. But most East Germans, by an overwhelming majority, say their lives are better off because of this, that freedom and economic advance and all of the opportunities have improved their life quality. That's why the Berlin Wall fell, because people wanted something better than what they were getting. Ultimately, maybe not in '89, maybe 10 years earlier, 5 years later, 20 years, but that was a root part of the fall of the wall. But there are two areas where I think they're different from the Westerners still today. One is a concern about social equality. So there's a classic question that we ask in public opinion surveys in Germany. It used to be asked after World War II, it was, fascism was a pretty good idea, just badly carried out. Now we ask, socialism is a pretty good idea, just poorly carried out, badly carried out. Only 40% of people in the West thought that in 1990. Today it's still around 40%. In 1990, about 80% of East Germans thought socialism was a good idea, badly carried out. I'll pause for a second to think, what should have happened after 20 years? And the answer is nothing's happened. Still today, about 80% of East Germans think that socialism, there's still a commitment to social equality that makes them very different from Westerners. So the spending on the welfare state, the protection of unemployment benefits, job guarantees, there's a lingering difference about what the role of the state should be, which isn't anti-democratic. It might just say that they think like Swedes, right? Rather than West Germans who are much more market-oriented. But it's a contrast of what they think government should be about that persists to today as a legacy of the past. Not in the sense of the old regime, but in the sense of a concern for others, a sense of community that was more developed in the East. The other thing that separates Easterners and Westerners today is not so much a commitment to democracy. I gave you those examples of 1990. If we went back and did it again in 2006, 2008, 2010, we have questions of the same sort. Both East Germans and West Germans have a very strong commitment to the democratic ideal, that it's desirous for Germany to have a strong democracy, that democracy is the best form of government. Where they differ is East Germans ironically say democracy isn't working very well and it could work better. Westerners think we want a democracy and we're doing just fine. I think this is the kind of flip side of being through the experience of what the real alternative was living under the German Democratic Republic, where they say people can have more influence, we can have more democracy, we can expand the political process. The commitment to make government more responsive to the people, which is kind of ironic. Here it is, these commies are telling the Western Democrats to be more democratic. When they wrote their constitutions in Eastern German states, each one of them carried a referendum and initiative proposal as a commitment to grassroots democracy. West Germans are a little hesitant to give so much power to the average citizen. So I think this cynicism isn't cynicism that's a negative thing, it's cynicism, let's do it better, which is actually a positive thing. So I think my time is probably up, although I should also say, when Steve's generous introduction ended with the 8 movies, when I last gave a talk at Florida State, where I used to teach a couple of weeks ago, the first question from the students were, which movies? So let me answer. The last one was TED 2 a week ago. Look for me wearing a Hawaiian shirt at Comic-Con. Okay. Any other questions about movies we'll do during the reception? So what are the bigger lessons? And again, I think it overlaps with what Congressman Royce said. One, we overestimated the viability of the autocratic state in the East. We thought they were 10 feet tall. They were a threat to the Western alliance. People supposedly bought into the system. If they bought into the system, you wouldn't have had to have a wall. If they bought into the system, you wouldn't have had to have such an extensive secret police. In a country of 16 million people, the Stasi, the secret police, kept files on 16 million. If you're a political science major at Fullerton, it would have meant that at least 1 or 2 of your fellow students was keeping track of what questions you asked, what the professor said. And the professor was only there because he was ideologically supportive of the regime. This is where the lives of others can show you that it wasn't that people bought into the regime, it's that they couldn't see a way to get out. And that if the state had to use these repressive forces, it was a sign that they were trying to repress something. And we should have realized the potential for change was greater than we did at the time. I think the other thing that I take away from this is that we underestimated ourselves. And part of this comes from my academic research of public opinion polls. Part of it comes from talking to German colleagues who lived in East Germany, who came to the West to be tied into the academic community. What I get from that combination of evidence of talking to East Germans and doing research on East Germans is that we didn't realize how strong the appeal of democracy and freedom of the West was. That we thought you could be happy living in a closed society, or at least happy and contented enough that there wasn't pressure. And the appeal from the other side was to see a life that they couldn't experience. One of probably the most relevant, now it's also old. I was going to give a relevant example based on Michael Jackson. I was 25 when the wall came down, so that's my generation. When Michael Jackson gave a concert west of the Berlin Wall, all of the world east of the Berlin Wall was filled with Easterners who knew Michael Jackson was going to be there. They had an image of what life was like on the West from the media, from television, from friends coming back, and they didn't believe the propaganda of the East or the propaganda of the West, but they saw a way of life that was really appealing to them. And Germans would talk about, we want to go on vacation to Italy. We couldn't, East Germans. We want to go just visit our aunt in the West. We couldn't. We want to bitch and moan about the government. We couldn't. And that appeal of democracy and freedom, I think, not so visible to us because we live it every day, but was visible to them because they didn't live it at all. And we, I think, took ourselves for granted more so than the East Germans did. So thank you very much. That's it for me.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to hear remarks both by Honorable Congressman Ed Royce and Professor Russell Dalton. It was certainly a pleasure for me as somebody who was in Berlin in 1990 and was able to take down her own pieces of the Berlin Wall. So the piece that we'll see here is certainly more impressive than mine, but I did want to bring them because as Congressman Royce mentioned, you can't see much of the wall in Germany itself nowadays. We wanted to be sure that those of you in the audience have a chance to ask some questions of our speakers. So I would like to open up the floor, and if anybody has comments, questions, reactions.
Hi, this question's for the Congressman. What do you perceive is the major weakness of the Obama administration policy in regard to Putin's increasing aggressiveness in the Ukraine and Europe?
I think that for the West, our major, we view Russia as a country in decline. And I think in the West, that presupposes that this is not going to be the challenge that we might have had during the Cold War. Now, during the Cold War, it is true that we overestimated the potential of the Russians. But at the same time, if you look at a country like Sparta, which had no wealth, where it was illegal to own gold or silver, no savings, no art, it was still a militaristic dynamo. So if you were opposite a Spartan phalanx,
It didn't matter in Athens that you were part of the richest society. In fact, the Spartans defeated Athens. And we were staring at ICBMs. So it really didn't matter the GDP on the part of the Russians. What mattered, as Kennedy said, was the attitude in terms of what they were doing with their space program and their ICBM program. So at that time, we had probably a greater challenge. This time, you have a more intelligent adversary in Putin. I remember the first time I met him. It was in the early 90s. Myself and another member of Congress were invited to meet him, his deputy mayor, and another councilman from St. Petersburg. And we had along with us an American who knew some Russian, and I remember he and Putin, we were at a place called the Irish Times, a little pub in DC, and they were arm wrestling, the two of them arm wrestling. And I remember how seriously Putin took this. And, you know, this guy, Jack Wheeler, was a strong guy. Obviously, Putin was too. And as the beads of sweat are coming down and they're straining every sinew, neither was getting the advantage. And finally, Putin jumps up and Jack jumps up and Putin goes, CIA, and Jack goes, KGB. And I suddenly realized this is a different confrontation than I was imagining with a deputy mayor. There was something more going on. And so over the years, you look at Putin and you look at how he reacted to the fall of East Germany. He was station chief for the KGB in Dresden. I've got two East German friends from Dresden, architects. So here's the way the Westerners reported this. As you recall at the time, the mob, or the German citizens, they went in, they busted into the Stasi headquarters. They took the files, they tore them up. They were looking at the files. Then they headed up the street to KGB headquarters. One guy, one colonel remained there to hold that post. The door was broken open. It was Vladimir Putin. He pulls out his revolver and he aims at the forehead of the first guy that comes through the door. And he says, I heard what you did at Stasi headquarters. This is not Stasi headquarters. This is KGB. You will back out, those behind you will back out, or I will kill the next 7 of you. And I will lock this door and I will destroy these files, and when I'm done destroying these files, I will go. The reason we have Merkel talk to Putin is because she does it in German. She understands the mindset. The head of state is a former East German subject, after all, Chancellor Merkel. And she knows that what we're dealing with here is a man who is very, very angry. He was in line. KGB leadership had a history of coming to power. And that power was diminished by what happened to the satellite countries that I talked about in Central Asia, in Eastern Europe. So we're dealing with an individual with attitude. And I guess my advice to the administration, as well as to our European allies in NATO, is to be mindful that his own citizens that right now give him an 85% approval rating. Remember, it did not matter in Sparta, for example, that Spartans could see that Athenians were wealthier. What mattered to Spartan was the great Lycurgus, the lawgiver, had given them a system, and they'd been mesmerized. They'd been brainwashed into that system. And for 600 years, Sparta stood under that system. Individuals like this still carry these attitudes. We have to get better at communicating with them, especially now that he's moved Russia back towards the hostility, towards the belief that Ukrainians are beating Russians, that Estonians are beating them in the streets, that Russian ethnic minorities in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan are being kicked and beaten. This is what Russians are being told every day. And they're being worked into a frenzy. And we need to work them back to see what's really going on and to see what Putin is doing to them. And the non-combative or non-confrontational way to do this is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. We need to make that work again.
Any other questions? Please, Steve.
In 1953, the people of East Germany rose up in an abortive attempt to oust the East German government. This was on June 17th of 1953, and the West Germans commemorated the event. Among other things, I believe it was Charlottenburger Chaussee was renamed June 17th Boulevard, and there was even a national holiday that was named that commemorated the event on June 17th. Do the Germans still commemorate this event?
You know, I would have to ask Klaus and Karen, my Eastern German friends, their feelings about that abortive attempt. But you know, the same thing happened with Dubček, with the Spring in the Czech Republic and in Hungary. I remember the reaction of the West at the time. I was at Catella High School, and we were reading Soviet Life magazine to give the instructor was explaining to us, our exam question was defend Russia's reoccupation of the Czech Republic from the standpoint of the spheres of influence argument. And so it wasn't always the case that everyone thought that pushing this concept of liberalization in Eastern Europe was necessarily a goal for the West. Some did. Some, like Reagan, were pushing it mightily. But there was some ambivalence in other quarters. And for many, détente was something that we were quite prepared to live with. And it was relatively unusual for someone like Reagan to say that at the end of the day, he wanted to see the entire transformation of Europe, Eastern Europe, into democratic societies, and to put forward a plan to do it through informational diplomacy, as well as you well know, some of the things we did with the price of oil, you know, working with other allies and with the monetary unit in order to destabilize Eastern Europe. There was a concerted effort by Kohl in Germany, by Reagan, and of course by Thatcher in Britain to sort of destabilize the Soviet system. But that cohesive plan did not come together until later, and our hearts go out to the family members who lost family in the East with the uprisings, you know, across Europe, which occurred in the 50s and the 60s to no effect.
Professor Dalton, did you want to respond to that question?
So he's referring to the one political holiday that the West had up until unification, which was to celebrate a uprising in East Berlin. And I think part of it is the legacy of the Cold War, that you celebrate the problems in the East because you don't have anything yet to celebrate in the West. Imagine how much the history of our country is tied into things like, well, Veterans Day, right? 4th of July, President's Day. East Germany in the 1950s couldn't very well celebrate April 20th, Adolf Hitler's birthday. They couldn't celebrate Veterans Day. We probably wouldn't have been happy about Germans marching around in uniform. So I think it's really part of the Cold War, post-World War II experience. And I think they ended it, didn't they? And now they've substituted Unification Day.
Unification Day.
And all the other holidays, though, are still Saint so-and-so's Day, Saint such-and-such Day, because of this political sensitivity about history.
I will say the street still bears the name, and it is a major artery in Berlin, right? It's the artery that leads right up to the Brandenburg Gate. So the memory is still alive if you're traveling through the heart of the city.
All right, and our last question here, student.
My question is for Dr. Granata and Dr. Dalton. I just want to know if you could speak a little bit more to the erasure and also maybe the legacy of East Germany as it exists today, and maybe the differences in culture between Aussies and Westies and how they see themselves today.
Sure, I'll start. That's a great question. And I think it also comes back to the comment that Congressman Royce said about why we don't see much of the Berlin Wall standing in the city today. I mean, the informed traveler or a historically minded person can know where to look in the city, but the casual visitor or the everyday Berliner will not see the proud displays of the Berlin Wall. And a lot of that does have to do with a lack of consensus within the country of what meaning to give to this history. You know, the Western story of triumph and a much more conflicted memory of either reminders of oppression or reminders of complicity with a dictatorship, with Stasi history. And so right now, it's a little bit easier for that history to not to be discussed so explicitly when it comes to the wall. That being said, certainly this week there are going to be some very serious celebratory events in the city of Berlin. It's not as if those things aren't occurring, but the wall itself and the history of the wall is a much more conflicted memory. And a lot of that does have to do with East Germans, as Professor Dalton explained, while certainly not nostalgic for their dictatorship and certainly embracing of democratic values, as the public opinion research shows, feeling a sense of displacement and a sense of certain aspects of their history having been devalued or misunderstood in the more triumphalist historical narrative that's kind of emerged since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, I agree entirely of this sense of tension. And maybe the relevant example is after World War II, one saw that the majority of Westerners didn't want to talk about what had just taken place, even within the family, because it would lead naturally to the question about, Dad, why did you vote for Hitler? What were you doing under the old regime? And what we've seen is the further away the Third Reich became, the more open discussion about it was, because the more it became depersonalized. In the East German case, they struggled with some of the same things, the Stasi files that the congressman mentioned. Should those be open so you knew who was informing on you, who kept you from getting a job? Or should we draw a line and the past is past? Who was complacent, who was not complacent? What should we do about them? So there's a real similar kind of struggle about some Germans want to just forget the past and start with a blank slate. Others say there's a time for accountability and now's the time. You know, if you lost a relative to the regime, do you want to just forget about it? But if, on the other hand, the only way you could get into college was by being complacent with the regime, do you want that to be held against you? So Angela Merkel went through the Communist Youth Organization and had to be politically correct. But clearly that doesn't affect her values. So it's a really complicated issue. And one of the things I try to do when I teach German politics is make people realize that if your role was reversed, it becomes a very hard issue to deal with, because you can then see both sides of it and there isn't a single answer about what do you do with the people from the old regime and how do you confront your history and how do we find a balance when we're talking about your grandparent or your neighbor or your boss or your own children. Well, they used to have a favorite thing they did. At night, they have no commercials on television, so when it's time for kids to go to bed, they have a little Sandman that goes on that says, Lieber Kinder, still Weihnachten, have a little song that they sing. They had one on the west and one on the east. The kindergarten teachers would ask the kids, what did the Sandman sing last night? So the kids would, if they said the song from the west, that would go on the record. The parents are watching Western TV. So in that all-pervasive environment, how do we deal with our history now? And that's the tension that they deal with.
Wonderful questions. I'm just going to close by acknowledging the various student groups that helped make this event possible. We had the European Studies Society, the Cultural and Public History Association, Pi Sigma Alpha, which is the Political Science Honor Society, and the CSU Intelligence Community Center for Academic Excellence. Thank you so much, students, and I know a lot of you are here today. I'm going to then just mention as well for the students that Joe Lopez will give us some information on the tours to see the actual piece of the Berlin Wall that the Nixon Library has generously made available for us to view.
And let's give our panelists a round of applause.